In the last talk, we were thinking about this myriad of issues that exist in any architectural problem, and how do you go about addressing all those different issues. And we were talking about an approach that Paul Rudolph advocated, which is that you select one or a few aspects of the building, you reach a kind of perfection in that regard, but then you ignore many aspects of the building. And Paul Rudolph said if we solve more problems, our buildings would be far less potent. We need to concentrate on one or a few aspects. So in this talk, we're going to extend the conversation we had about that in the last talk and look at several different approaches of different ways to implement that idea. So we're going to go back to our course outline of issues of form, issues of physical considerations, issues of human factors. And we're going to be looking at two buildings that emphasize form very strongly, but then maybe neglect physical considerations and human factors. And then we'll look at two buildings that really emphasize human factors, but maybe don't concentrate so much on the other two. And then we'll look at buildings that emphasize physical considerations, but again, maybe neglect the other two. And I hope at this point in the class, you're trying to figure out what you think is the most important in architecture. And obviously, the architects here are trying to see where their heart lies and what they think is most important. And they're taking that Paul Rudolph approach, and it's manifesting itself in the design of the building. So let's see what the consequences are of each of these three different approaches. And I would challenge you to think, are any of these three interesting to me, or do I find all three of those problematic? So first, let's look at buildings that are very strong in form, but perhaps weaker in the other regards. So this is the Ayub Hospital in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The architect is Lou Khan. We've looked at a number of Lou Khan buildings. We looked at Exeter Library. We looked at Bryn Mawr Dorm. We looked at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. Magnificent architect, absolutely one of the premier architects of the 20th century in America. And this was a project that he did. He was working on Sri Bainglaranara, the capital of Bangladesh in Dhaka. And while he was working on that project, the people who were building this hospital nearby said, well, we've got this famous American architect working in our city, coming over and visiting regularly. Let's have him do our hospital. So they were very much enamored of this famous, very accomplished American architect. And he was brought into the project and kind of given free rein to do what he felt was just the right thing for this hospital in Bangladesh. So this was in a period where Lou Khan was very interested in geometry, these great circular forms, and then segments of circles within that. It's also a period where he was very interested in masonry construction. He famously said, I asked a brick what it wanted to be, and it said an arch. So he was using these curvilinear arched forms and making them into big circles, and obviously very strong roots in mathematics and geometry. And it's a powerful, powerful building in terms of form. And it's not just that geometry on the front, but also then as you go back into the building, there is a perpendicular line here that has circles in two directions there. And then there's another line that has circles in yet another direction. So now there's this kind of complex puzzle of circular forms that are intersecting with each other. And then as the light comes in, it makes really magnificent patterns in the floor of both of these areas. It's a really amazing and extraordinary play of light and form and material and the brick and the arch and many of the things that Kahn cared about a lot. He's definitely playing through that in a really magnificent way there. He in fact is making 3 porches here. There's the first porch on the outside. There's a second porch here, which is where we're seeing here. And then a third double-decker porch over there, all of them with these intersections of arched forms and this complex geometry all coming together in these 3 huge porches. Now, if you're asking me, I would say, what is the problem he wanted to solve? Well, it was all about geometry and masonry and the arch and play of light between these mathematical and geometrical forms. And he's doing that absolutely magnificently. But this was a hospital. And the program called for a very large number of hospital rooms, hospital beds. That was their primary need here. And all of this kind of 3 porches at the beginning here, all of that space was extra programmatic. So that was not something the hospital came to him and said, oh yeah, we need this huge amount of space for lobby, and but it was something that he brought to the table. And of course, they had a kind of limited budget. It's a poor country. And so he convinced them that they should spend their money on these 3 magnificent porches on the front of the building. And that meant that the rest of the building, you can see that's about the amount of the 3 porches, and the rest of the building had to be much smaller than originally anticipated. So they thought of it having X number of beds, and in the end it had way, way, way fewer number of beds because the money went for those magnificent porches and was not available for beds and surgery suites and doctor's offices. And Kahn justified that by saying, well, you know, you can add those later. This will be the front of the building, this will be there forever, and you can always add more of we'll build the first kind of suite of those rooms, and you can always add more later. So I was here about 10 years after the building was first occupied, and no addition had been made at that point. In this space, all of that area up there was just jammed with cots, with people being treated out there. The hallways had cots along the side of them. They clearly did not have enough beds in this hospital. And they were having to turn people away as well. And so the beds had not been constructed. The 3 porches were there, but the real healthcare benefit of, you know, places for treatment of patients was greatly diminished in the building. So I don't know. In terms of human factors, is it reasonable to think of diminishing significantly the number of beds for the sake of building these porches on the front? Now, another kind of compromise that came was because all of that, in order for these big circles to be bold and strong, they needed to be set off by some big solid walls like that. And that meant that you couldn't punch little holes for, you know, rooms for patients or for surgery suites or for doctor's offices. You didn't want to have a lot of little windows through there. So he concentrates a few windows in that little courtyard, and there are periodic courtyards through the building. But many, many of the rooms just don't have windows. So because it's such a solid form with just these big few singular openings, and one whole side of the building, the long side of the building, is in fact covered with the porches. So there's no availability for windows or natural light to the interior rooms on that side. So the net result of that is that many, many of the patient rooms, many of the surgery suites, many of the offices just don't have windows. Now, that's particularly a problem in Bangladesh, where they don't air condition their buildings all the time. And in fact, at the time the building was built and the time I visited there, power outages were very, very common, so that you're constantly going to be having the electricity go off. So I am visiting with the director of the hospital, and we're sitting in his office, and we're talking away about, he had been there when Kahn designed the building. He had a huge respect for Kahn. He spoke of him in whispered tones, like he was some sort of god, and very, very respectful of their ability to have this renowned American architect come and work with them. In the middle of the conversation, the electricity went off. And he just very calmly opened the drawer of his desk, took out a candle, struck a match, lit the candle, never missed a beat, just continued with the conversation. This was very, very common for him. His office had no windows, so there was no natural light. And when the electricity went off, he just lit a candle. I asked him, well, do you have to do the same thing in your surgery suites? And he said, yeah, it's a problem. It's very difficult to do surgery by candlelight. We have some generators, but some emergency generators, but not enough. He was a very sweet man, very accepting of all of these problems, but truthfully, he should have had windows in those rooms that would have given natural light, and then if the electricity went off, it wouldn't be so awful. Also, they had same issues with conditioning the spaces, because the electricity would go off and it would get stiflingly hot inside, and there was no natural ventilation. So there were enormous problems by the fact that there were not windows to all of the small rooms inside the hospital. So yeah, in terms of human factors and accommodating the right number of beds, it's a real compromise. In terms of just getting simple things like natural light and ventilation to many of these rooms, greatly compromised and a real problem. But maybe an even bigger problem is I had seen pictures of this, and I was really looking forward to seeing it. I'd made this pilgrimage all the way over the other side of the world, and I never realized, never mentioned in any article on this building, that that's a west-facing facade. And Bangladesh is a very hot country. It's equatorial. It's super hot in that country. So I was there in December, and the sun started coming around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and for the rest of the afternoon, it just baked on that whole porch. And all that high thermal mass masonry absorbed all that heat. In the floor, the matrix in the terrazzo was black. It absorbs all that heat. And the result was, even in December, at the end of the day, it was stiflingly hot in that porch. And they said that in the summertime, yeah, after about 2 o'clock, you can't go in there because it did not respect the sun and did not deal with thermal aspects of the building. Now, again, if we select form as the thing we want to concentrate on, and he made this beautiful interaction of shape and light and material, but at what price? And if you ignore some aspects of the building, like human factors or like physical considerations, is that worth it? Is that a moral thing to do? Okay, let's look at a second example that I would say very strong in terms of form, but perhaps ignoring some other aspects of the building. This is the housing at La Défense. This is this area right through here by M.I.T, French architect. It's in, La Défense is a kind of outshoot from the city of Paris. If you go past, on the Champs-Élysées, past the Étoile, and then you keep going way, way, way out, you hit La Défense, which is this huge center of commerce. Downtown Paris has very few high-rise buildings, but out at La Défense, there are tons of high-rise buildings. It's a very expensive place to live. It's the home for a lot of corporate headquarters. But the French, being the French, they realized that you need all kinds of people in a community, and there would be people who would need to be in service jobs, and they needed to have some low-income housing in this community. But they didn't want dowdy, ugly, low-income housing. So they hired this very chic architect, M.I.T, and they asked him to design beautiful, beautiful housing that would be actually very low-income housing. So he makes these kind of amoeba-shaped buildings, very sculptural, and as you saw in the previous slide, whole cluster of them, different heights, and with this kind of camouflage mosaic tile pattern on the outside. Around it, there are these kind of sculptural landforms that allow the building to look really like it's just completely sculptural, just sitting on these articulated, wavy landforms here. Each of the buildings is a little different, but they share this shimmery tile and the camouflage pattern and these funny windows that are either little portholes or little teardrop-shaped windows or little square windows with curved corners. But they're quite small windows and very large surfaces of the mosaic tile. Now, they are stunning, and this was done a long time ago. I think it looks very contemporary still. I went back to see it summer before last, and it's striking still. But this is low-income housing. So all those amoeba-shaped buildings, when you get inside those, the rooms in low-income housing are very small. And so they're tiny little bedrooms. And maybe multiple walls are curved. So I didn't have the nerve to take pictures in this one unit where I was invited in. But wow, you couldn't put furniture in this room. They couldn't afford custom furniture, so they have very standard rectilinear furniture. And sometimes there's not a wall long enough for the bed to go against or for the sofa to go against. Very weird, oddly shaped room, so it's very hard to inhabit it. It's mostly inhabited by North African immigrants, and so they don't have a lot of resources. There are a lot of children that live in the building. All of this area out here seems to me markedly inhospitable. So in terms of humanism, wow, not a very good place for families and children and so on to be here. So I don't know, in some ways there's this complete anachronistic feeling of the people who are living here and what they need, and these striking sculptural objects on the skyline. Also in terms of physical considerations, it's obviously pays no attention to the sun. You could have gotten a lot of good heat gain in the northern climate if the windows had been larger and oriented properly. Instead, the windows in the rooms, they're very, very small, almost like just little portholes. And then these wacky shapes. How do you put a curtain on that window? You can see these poor people have just kind of draped a sheet over it, and it's not working very well. But everything is so customized that it's very hard to just deal with simple things like the sun and opening your window and getting a little ventilation. And many of those things are not well resolved in the building. So again, very strong in terms of form, but some real weaknesses in human factors and physical considerations. So now let's shift gears. Let's look at some buildings that are very strong in human factors, but maybe weaker in other regards. So we looked earlier in the semester at the history faculty in Cambridge. And that one is this whole academic building on the Cambridge campus by Jim Sterling. And we talked about how beautiful it is in terms of function. And it really does bring people in, circulation desk, reading room, stacks, study carrels, it's so beautifully organized. And then in 3 dimensions, putting all the public functions on the lower level, the classrooms, the seminar rooms, the faculty offices, slowly getting more private as you go up. Everybody getting views down into that big central library space. terms of function, oh my God, this is a magnificent building. And it clearly articulates that function very, very well. But in terms of some other things, like physical considerations, not so much. There's lots and lots of light that comes into that library. And it's very pleasant, actually, in that space. But that has ultraviolet light. And books do not like ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light deteriorates paper, and it deteriorates the binding of books. If you've ever put a book on the back, behind the back seat in your car, and let the sun shine through the back window, and forget it for a few weeks and then pull it out, just in a few weeks it's like destroyed, the book. So it's a library that's all about books. And there's all this ultraviolet light, and that worked to deteriorate the books. The other thing is the skylights actually had terrible problems with leaking, and so water would come into the space. Again, books do not like water. So here's an image at a point where they had cleared everything out, and they were trying to solve some of these problems and re-inhabit the building. So physical considerations, not so good. In terms of form, I actually think it's a very striking, very handsome building if you take it apart from anything else. But it actually sits on the Cambridge campus, which is a very gentle, very sweet, kind of beautiful, charming environment. And I'm not saying you replicate that, but there seems to be no nod whatsoever to making something that actually felt comfortable and genial in terms of form in its context. And the building was very, very controversial from day one on the Cambridge campus. So, I don't know, strong in terms of human factors, but some weaknesses in terms of physical considerations or form. Another example here, this is the medical faculty building at University of Louvain in Brussels. The architect is Lucian Kroll. Lucian Kroll has a very interesting idea about architecture. He believes that architects should be like lawyers. They should be advocates. So if you're a lawyer and you're defending a guy who's up for murder, and you know that that guy murdered his victim, you do not walk in the courtroom and give any indication of that whatsoever. You are meant to only say what is beneficial to your client. Your client is everything. You are the advocate for your client. You are not to make any independent judgment of what's right or wrong or true or false. So Lucian Kroll thinks architects should be like that you should listen to the user. Whoever is using this building, they're the authority. They should be telling you what to do, and the architect should be executing or advocating for the user of the building. So when he came to this instance, he basically asked all the users, what would you like to have? And this is some residences for the faculty. It's residence for the students sometimes. It's classrooms, laboratories, all kinds of things you might need for medical education. And there are parts of the building that are very, kind of country and rustic. And because the users, some users wanted that kind of feeling to the building, this kind of, almost earthy kind of feeling. Then there were other users that wanted, no, we want futuristic, space age kinds of things. And that's what we're interested in. And some of them wanted lots and lots of glass, and some didn't want much glass at all. And some of them wanted balconies, and some didn't want balconies. And so Lucian Kroll and his team were advocates for the users. And they simply let the building be what all the users wanted it to be. Now, in terms of physical considerations, it was incredibly, incredibly difficult to build and expensive and maintain. It also did not pay any particular thermal attention to orientation, because if somebody wanted a big amount of glass, well, they got it, whether that was the right orientation or not. So it's not ideal in that regard. In terms of physical considerations, not good. In terms of form, I guess I'd let you make your own judgment. Many people think it's just butt ugly, incredibly chaotic and confusing. When I was there, somebody said, you know, the best thing about living in that building, you don't have to look at it. So they thought that, you know, it was fine if you were inside the building, but from the outside, a difficult building to take. So again, it's concentrating on one or a few aspects of the building, in this case, human factors, but neglecting issues of physical considerations or form. So let's look at that third option, which is to concentrate on physical considerations, but then maybe not worry so much about issues of form or issues of human factors. This is Kresge Auditorium at MIT. The architect is Eero Saarinen. We've looked at many buildings by Saarinen through the semester. John Deere headquarters, Orson Stiles College at Yale, TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport. Excellent, excellent article in the modern era, the middle of the 20th century. And in this case, he's taking on a very strong technical challenge. He's very interested in construction of thin shell concrete. How can you use the minimum amount of concrete to make the maximum span for a building? So this is meant to be a performance hall kind of building. It needs a big central space. He's thinking, how can I span that space in the very most technically sophisticated way, and a way that would be economical and would use the material to its optimum. And he's here at MIT, and in fact he convinces his client at MIT, yes, we need to do this kind of experimental structure that's really advancing the field in terms of how we do construction and how we do structure. So MIT bought into that, and they made this thin shell concrete structure. It actually is only 4 inches thick at the top, and just like in the Pantheon, we saw it got thicker and thicker and thicker as the loads accumulated and it went to the bottom. This goes from 4 inches thick at the top to 17 inches thick at the bottom, where it hits on 3 different points there. It is really an extremely innovative and creative use of an ancient building form, which is the dome, but now using it in reinforced concrete and using it to make this span for the auditorium. Now, in terms of physical considerations, incredible. That's the problem Eero Saarinen wanted to solve. Now, unfortunately, at the beginning of this project, MIT wanted a kind of all-purpose performance space so that you could do drama in there, you could do theater, especially student theater groups could do performances there, but also like shows that were traveling could perform on the MIT campus. There was no other facility for that. They wanted to be able to have musical performances there. They wanted to be able to have lectures there. But you know, all kinds of performances that would be in that space. Well, for many of those things, you would normally have a fly loft. That is that big box that's above the stage where the scenery goes up and down. And most theater, that's de rigueur, and most theater spaces or performance spaces have a fly loft. Well, obviously, fly loft and this idea of the thin shell concrete dome, those were not compatible. The fly loft would have needed to go right here, and it would have spoiled the whole idea. And so Saarinen said, well, the future of theater is to be much more abstract. And we're not going to have all those funny scenery going up and down. It's just going to be all be done with lighting and with much more abstract sets. And so we'll encourage innovative theater here. And we don't really need a fly loft. And he convinced them that they did not need a fly loft. And so it was built without a fly loft. The result of that is that honestly, they just don't do any kind of theater performance there anymore. Another thing is that because it actually, it goes down the lowest, right above the stage here, where all the green rooms would normally be, there's really not enough room for that, so they all kind of went into the basement down here. So even for any kind of performance, the ability to get your performers up onto the stage and off, or for costume changes or anything like that, very difficult. So it's not very good for theater performance. It's not very good for any kind of performance, even musical, because the green rooms don't work very well. But the thing that really is extremely difficult about the building is the acoustics. So that shape of the dome is very, very good for focusing sound. When a sound goes up, it comes back down, goes up, comes down, goes up, comes down. And there is a kind of focus at about right there, which is about right there. Now, originally there were fewer of these. Some of them got added later. But even so, you can see up to that concrete dome, and that was very much the idea, that you could see up to that dome from inside. And that dome is not a good acoustical shape. What you want, let's say, for musical performance or even for a lecture, is you want to distribute the sound. You want it moving all over the room. But in this case, it's concentrating the sound. And if you stand right there and you stomp your foot like that, it does what's called flutter echo. It goes bang, 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 bang. And it just keeps bouncing back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it diminishes. And the result of that is if you're sitting in a seat right there and you make a sound, it's constantly being reflected back to you like that. There also is acoustical phenomena here called creep, where if you whisper even toward the wall here, it creeps along that curvy back, and you can hear it over here just as if that person were standing next to you. So in my acoustics class at MIT, my acoustics professor, Bob Newman, he loved to take a field trip over to Kresge Auditorium and show you everything you should never, ever do in a performance space in terms of acoustics. You do not want to concentrate that sound. You do not want to have that kind of creep. You need to think of acoustics as a major force in designing the shape of that space. But instead, the shape of the space was being determined by the idea of the thin shell concrete, and other aspects of the building were being neglected or diminished. So it's okay for a lecture if you have enough PA system. It certainly can't distribute that sound of the lecture on its own. It concentrates the sound, so even a speaker needs a really good PA system. I went there a couple of times for musical performances, and they had to drop microphones over the orchestra so that they were amplifying the horns and amplifying the woodwinds and amplifying the drums. They were amplifying everything separately in a very complex way and delivering it back to you in the auditorium. Normally you want the room to do that, but it does such a poor job of it, they had to use electronic amplification to make that work if they were going to have a musical performance there. And the truth is they just don't have many musical performances there. You might as well go listen to it on your stereo. It's not live music anymore. So it's greatly diminished the flexibility and the usability of the space because of that structural form that was key. We're going to close looking at, again, a building very strong in terms of physical considerations, but weaker in other regards. This is the Centre Pompidou in Paris. We looked at it earlier in the semester. It's this tour de force of explaining technical issues of a building, all the physical considerations of the building, the structural system, very explicit, all the heating and air conditioning system, the ductwork, the intakes, the fan coils, everything in the building, even the conveyance systems, the escalators, the transformers, all of the electrical wiring, all the conduits, all the elevators, everything technical about the building, all of those performative physical considerations, parts of the building. They're out there and they're explained to you, and it's a kind of beautiful manifestation of the way a 20th century building works technically. But I will say, in terms of other issues like function, human factors, Very problematic building. I mean, basically inside it's these big gymnasium-like spaces like we're seeing here. And most of them don't have any windows because it's all pipes and things like that on the outside. So if you want a kind of assembly function, it's marginally okay, but it actually feels like you're in a very low flat gym and you can't really see the speaker or it's not a very good gathering place. It's meant to have a big library in it. That library has no natural light. It's like trying to read a book in a gym. It doesn't have any intimacy. Certainly we've looked at some gorgeous libraries this semester. This is not one of them. The major function of the building is as an art gallery, but there is so much busy work going on in the ceiling there that you can hardly pay attention to the art down here. And so it was considered a very bad exhibition space and has been completely redone. So you can't see those pipes anymore. But then they had to put a lower ceiling. And so it's been difficult to actually function as an art gallery or as a library or as an assembly space. It's extremely difficult to find your way around. I was there again a year ago last summer. And oh my God, it's extremely confusing. And where the escalators are and where the elevators are, and because they're all out on the outside. They're not where you'd like them sort of centrally to get to everything conveniently, but you're constantly going out here, going up, going back here. And it's just a very confusing building to negotiate your way around. It also is, it's in the middle of an ancient part of Paris. This is the M.I.T, a historic district of Paris. And that district is full of older buildings that are made of materials that patina very well. The Centre Pompidou is made of materials that need to be gleaming and perfect and precise, and in order to look right, they have to be kind of right up to snuff. And so it actually doesn't look that way most of the time. All of that surface of all of those different things, it's just kind of an excessive amount of stuff to maintain and to keep painted and to keep repaired and to keep pristine and beautiful and bright, especially in a gritty city that's kind of dirty and things get dirt on them and things bump into them. And so the building was barely 20 years old when they had to shut the entire thing down. And it was shut down for more than a year, where they were just trying to repair all of that stuff on the outside. And so they finally got it back up again. But then when I was there a year and a half ago, it unfortunately is in very bad shape again. That's actually what the Centre Pompidou looks like. It's just not tenable, not practical to think that all those things will stay perfectly clean and perfect. And in fact, in the end, it looks ratty and deteriorated most of the time. So the real question here is this notion of Paul Rudolph tenable? The idea that you concentrate on one or a few aspects of a building and then you can ignore many aspects of a building. Can you really ignore many aspects of a building? Can you optimize just one or a few things and get that potency and then say, that's good, that makes great architecture? Or is that a flawed notion? In the next couple of talks, we'll look at some other alternatives.